All right, welcome back, y'all. This is going to be chapter 14 on transnational terrorism. This chapter is by Catherine Brown. So we'll jump straight into section 2. What is transnational terrorism? Um, they were very careful about their definition. So it is basically when a group or an individual uses or threatens violence by non state actors to influence citizens or governments in the pursuit of political or social change, right? So there's a lot of little pieces there. Um, at one point, however, uh, they claim that, quote, today's terrorism is transnational in cause, operation, and effect. Uh, it's a really bold statement, right? There are many terrorist actions and terrorist groups that are not transnational. So, yes, while we do have this sort of growing trend of transnational terrorism, especially with globalization, there are many sort of domestic terrorist groups or domestic terrorist actors. And a couple that I would point out are like Boko Haram in Nigeria. Occasionally they operate over the border, but mostly Nigeria. Hamas in Palestine. Ansar al Sharia in Libya. The JEM in Pakistan. And then, like, even in the United States, you could point to someone like the kid who killed Charlie Kirk, last week or a week before, the guy who shot the healthcare executive, right? Those weren't transnational goals, right? It was a terrorist act using violence to influence citizens or government in the pursuit of political or social change, but they were not in any way transnational. So I don't really know why they hit that idea so hard. Okay, section 3, motivation and goals. We know that motivation differs wildly, right, across uh, individual terrorists and terrorist groups. It can be ideological or political or religious. It can be in defense of a homeland, I guess, or what one would consider their homeland. It can be financial. So there are many different sort of motivations for terrorists and terrorist groups. Post 9/11, much ado was made about religion as the basis for terrorism, but there's a lot of motivation out there for terrorists. They talk about at some point sort of radicalization theory, but I would say this isn't really applicable in all cases. Um, you know, Sort of the idea of radicalization often makes us think that these are just crazy people committing crazy acts of violence, but there is um, method to the madness, right? They are thoughtful about who they are targeting and where they are targeting. Um, so I don't know. I would have to push back a little bit on radicalization theory. Yes, we have seen some sort of religious fanaticism tied to some terrorism, but there's a lot of different ways of going about this, right? Okay. Section 3, activities. They want to point out here that the location and the event is often very important, right? So the London subway bombings, the concert in France, the Charlie Hebdo uh, uh, massacre, basically against the French newspaper, um, 9/11. All of these things had symbolic value for these terrorist groups. When you think about the trade towers and the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the White House, right? During the 9/11 attacks, obviously these are not only targeted for massive violence and death of as many citizens as they can cause. But they're also powerful symbols of capitalism, of what the Taliban and other groups would see as sort of exploitation and colonialism and these sorts of things, right? And the Pentagon and the White House obviously are, seats of military power in the United States, and so these things have symbolic significance. Uh, Charlie Hebdo was an attack on a French paper. Um, some cartoons, including Muhammad, were published, and so they attacked Charlie Hebdo's newspaper headquarters and killed many of their staff members. But again, this is sort of it's symbolic, right? About media and about um, I guess cartoonization of Muhammad, things of this sort. We also see lots of religious places attacked, religious houses, synagogues, mosques, churches, etc. Not only from Islamist terrorists, but also from white nationalists in America. Um, the kid who walked into the black church in South Carolina and killed a bunch of people. There was the synagogue shooting a couple years ago in Pennsylvania. Um, so these things, these religious places are often targeted as well. And then the last one I would point out is Boko Haram in Nigeria, who is an Islamist group, kidnapped a whole bunch of like hundreds of elementary school girls from a school there because they don't want young women being taught. And so they kidnapped a whole bunch of very, very young women from school, which was just horrifying, right? Let's see. The other sort of goal here is not just sort of the location or the event or the symbolism, but they also want to provoke a response, right? Not only from citizens in the targeted state, but also their own citizens for recruitment purposes. But they also want to provoke the state actors to over respond, right? And arguably, this happened with Iraq and Afghanistan and dragged us into these, generation long wars, which, I mean, let's be real, probably weren't all that successful. The Taliban still runs Afghanistan. Um, Iraq isn't a great place at this point, right? So it can cost these countries a lot of money, a lot of blood, the death of their military personnel and others, and it can also sort of be a negative feedback loop for recruitment, right? As they use videos of say American troops bombing or you know, these sorts of things, or drone attacks have become very popular. These sorts of things, they use them to recruit further um, further terrorists into their organizations. And I would also point out today. I mean, it's literally going on. Hamas attacked Israel October 7, 2023, killed more than 1,000 people, mostly civilians, kidnapped hundreds, um, and they got Israel to respond, obviously. But Israel's heavy response, I guess I would say, has led to a lot of international furor. And now, in the last couple of weeks, you've actually seen many Western countries um, back Palestine and say that we are going to, for the first time, recognize Palestinian sovereignty. And so, these things can have long term consequences, right? Okay. Section 4, organization and resources. Um, I would point out here, this used to be one of the best ways of interceding in terrorist acts is to follow the communications, things of this sort. To maybe slip someone inside the organization as like a double agent or whatever. Um, but it's become more and more difficult, right? As technology has advanced, as encryption has advanced, as encryption has advanced, as apps allow for anonymous and secret communication. Um, and this is actually one of the main goals of those companies who are experimenting with and researching what's called quantum computing, is to increase encryption or increase the likelihood of decryption, right? Um, and so there's this massive race going on basically between the US/Europe and China for quantum computing, and they use this oftentimes for encryption or decryption methods. And then also, I would point out that finances are one of the best ways that our government organizations have to track and intercede on terrorist organizations. But again, this is also becoming more difficult as these sort of apps expand and allow for the shifting of finances across borders without having to use, say, like the remittance system or things like that. So this is becoming more and more and more difficult over time. Okay, section 5, countering transnational terrorism. Oftentimes, what we do, or what I guess the response is not only sort of a military response, but also sort of equipping and training locals. But this can be problematic, right? In Iraq, we know that many of those that we equipped, or Iraq and Afghanistan, many that we equipped and trained actually went to the other side, or were playing double agent. This can also sort of bite us in the ass, right? One that I would point out is the Mujahideen in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The United States, especially through a senator named Charlie Wilson, there's actually a book and a movie about it now, but the United States was supporting, um, I don't know, maybe terrorist groups. I don't know how to describe it, but the Mujahideen were fighting against the Russians in Afghanistan and Pakistan during the 1980s and 1990s. Well, we were feeding them Stinger missiles, machine guns, training them, etc. Well, this turned around and bit us in the butt because those same weapons, Stinger missiles, training, etc., were used against us in 9/11 and then afterward, right? So Russia had long retreated by that point, but uh, decades later, after the fact, this came back around on us, right? And then there's also the problem of sort of freedom versus security, this sort of philosophical debate, right? Um, Anytime there are terrorist actions or mass violence, there tends to be a pretty massive, not only citizen response, but government response. So if you think of the aftermath of 9/11, we passed through numerous bills. Not only do you have to now take off your shoes at airports and things of that sort, but we also got the Patriot Act, which allowed the US government to monitor messages, emails, all of these sorts of things. The Snowden releases showed that they were even monitoring American citizens' stuff, which had prior to then been a big no no. And so there is always this push pull between freedom and security, right? um, let's see. And then the final thing I wanted to mention is there's some new movement in this area, especially from the United States and the Trump administration, in that I think we have now bombed 3 or 4 different ships, which came out of port in Venezuela. uh, purportedly carrying drugs. And the Trump administration has basically declared that they are quote unquote terrorists, right? And so they're just sort of blowing these ships out of the water. I don't know. There's not a lot of sort of media coverage. This is touchy, right? First of all, historically, drug interdiction and terrorism have been very distinct things, right? Um, Secondly, it's a little bit concerning that we're just blowing ships out of the water. It makes you wonder, say, American drug dealers are shipping, I don't know, methamphetamines or ecstasy to Europe, say, and France decides to blow our ship out of the water and kill our citizens. Is that acceptable? Because that's sort of the precedent that we are setting at this point. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the future and whether any sort of evidence comes out that those ships actually were carrying drugs and these sorts of things. So something to think on. All right, that's all I got for you on this one. I'll have the next one up here in just a minute, and that'll be the last one for this unit. Thanks for being here and have a great day.